Welcome back to the channel, folks, and to another painting tutorial. Now the subject is Sturmtigers, and I do have a Sturmtiger tutorial already out, but the previous tutorial focused more on washing and highlighting, whereas this example is going to be much more about the camo. If you want to see washing and highlighting in detail, then I'll put a link in the description below and you can follow to that. I'll briefly cover it here, but this video is really going to be about creating a very distinctive camo. You can see from the opening slides that this is a very complicated camo. The camo blotches themselves are almost like disc camo. It isn't disc camo per se, but it looks almost like disc camo because the edges are so wavy, and then there's lots of internal disruptive shapes that look, as my client described it, lots of little dog bones. This demo is all about airbrushing, but you can do this by hand, folks, quite easily. It's just airbrushing allows you to be in complete control of the final shapes of the camo before you've even started spraying, and because you're spraying you get a very flat finish. You might have to do a little bit of brushwork to tidy up in places, but otherwise it's a very flat finish, which gives a nice overall result, whereas working with complicated camo shapes can result in ridges of paint appearing and such likes. I'll be using Vallejo paint, starting with Saddle Brown, as you can see here, then Italian Tank Crew, and then Dark Sand. So having sprayed the Saddle Brown on, given it time to be dry, typically I would make this first coat of paint over an undercoat for certain, because the paint can lift off when you're using this approach, and also that is very much the case when you have a plastic kit. Not so much a problem on resin, though the metal areas it can lift off quite easily and require a bit of touch up. So undercoat, then your first colour, let it dry overnight preferably before we start masking. Now what you can see me doing here is applying the general shape of the mask. It's not going to have all the little bits of details, all the tiny little curves at this point. I just want to get them in place and make sure that I've got the right balance, i.e. when I apply the next coat of paint, which is going to be the Italian Tank Crew, and then mask it, is there going to be enough space left for the amount of yellow that I want to finish with. So a bit of planning is required to get this right, a bit of experience will help a lot too. Now I have the blotches on, I'm taking a cocktail stick and you can see me just pushing out little lumps of the blue tack, and that is helping to create these little round shapes that border the camo blotches, and it's a very simple process. There's nothing complicated here. It's not like disc camo itself where each disc is perfectly round and you have to be very particular. We can just create the shapes here. If necessary, you just lift it back and do it again so you get the right look. You know, you're in control of the final look. And this also allows us to ensure that the edges of the blue tack are down nice and tight. That's an important point. Whatever kind of masking you're doing, are the edges down nice and tight so there's no paint drifting in. We want a hard edge, not a soft edge, and if the paint is creeping in underneath the masking, you're likely to end up with a soft edge. And you should note that I'm using a cocktail stick here because it's quite soft. It will give you sufficient control to be able to work the blue tack, but it will reduce the risk of something bad happening should you slip and then score the surface. That's where it's important to have the undercoat there, folks, because any scratches on the surface will show up straight away. You know, it's very hard to do anything about them, so you want to try and avoid them. And if you do make any scratches on the surface, leave that area unmasked and your subsequent coats of paint will take care of that. Now I'm not showing you the airbrushing, folks, because there's nothing much to that. I'm just building up layers until it is completely opaque, as it's got a solid coat of the colour that I want. Now it's important to let this layer of paint dry. You don't have to leave it till the following day like you did with the original coats. You know, the original coats are the most important one because they are the ones that are physically attached to the mini. This paint will stick to those coats, but it has to be touch dry so that you can confidently mask it and be sure you're not going to mess up the surface, roughen up the surface. Now I repeat the same process of masking, making sure that I'm leaving sufficient space between the previous masking that's now green so that I have the right yellow that is left. You know, so I've got the yellow imagine threads that are going to be going through this camo, and this is what I talked about before about having complete control over the final look. I can be sure before I spray on the final coat of paint, that's going to be the dark sand, that I'm happy with the look. So as before, it's big blobs of masking and then the cocktail stick to make all those little curvy edges to it. One thing to consider, it may look here as though there's going to be no yellow showing at all. You know, that's going to be dominated by the blotches, but what you've got to remember is those blotches are going to represent two colours. You can only see the green at the moment, but there's two colours there, and when you peel it off there's actually going to be a lot of yellow left. So don't be too worried that you're going to have not enough yellow. You'll find that it comes out really strongly because it's going to be all over the mini, whereas the blotches will be restricted to certain areas that are masked. Right folks, that's me sprayed on the yellow and it's time to peel all this off. Now this can be a tricky business. It's one where your fingernails, or if you're having to use it at some point, the cocktail stick might end up scratching the surface, so you need to be careful. Try to pull the blobs off. Even if you're using the cocktail stick, try to work the blob, don't lever the blob off by, you know, like trying to wedge the cocktail stick underneath it, and then as you can see, smaller parts might get pulled off the figure. They're easily put back on. Try to avoid masking them if you can. I often do that. If there's something that's really tricky, I won't put any masking over it and leave that like the base colour, the final colour that we're going to be spraying. Now I use blue tack because it's convenient and I've got it and I've had it for years, but there are other products available that you can buy from modelling shops, sort of black tacky kind of substance. I've never tried it. You may want to give it a go yourself, or you may want to use blue tack. I think either way works fine. It's just down to your own preferences and what you want to go and purchase to take these kind of steps. One final point about blue tack, it doesn't stick very well if the weather is cold. If your room is cold you may find it difficult to work with, but also if it's warm it starts to get really soft and stringy and becomes hard to remove. So if it's warm you might want to just stick it in the fridge for a few minutes before you start unpeeling it. Now for those disruptive shapes that we've got internal to the camo patches, and I'm using the base yellow colour here, dark sand. Now I'm painting a line and then putting a little, basically a short line on the end of it. It doesn't have to be an exact duplication of what we see on historical images. We're just going to be creating something for the tabletop here folks. Now it is possible that you could create some kind of stamp for this, but that would be extremely difficult to use because it's a very particular shape, and stamps, complicated stamps especially, are hard to apply with the exact amount of paint each time that is exactly the same wetness each time, and placing it perfectly flat on the surface as well so that it goes on nice and smooth and doesn't drift. It's very easy for a stamp to drift just a little bit, so I'm doing it all by hand. To begin with, I wasn't sure how many of these accents to paint, but I found myself painting quite a lot, making it look quite busy. Now, certain camos don't look good when they're busy, particularly ambush camo, unless you are keeping the dots just to the camo patches. It's when you cover the entire surface and lots of dots, it starts to look too busy. And as I'm restricting these accents to the camo patches, I don't think it looks too busy, and I think it actually helps confirm to the eye when it's sitting on the tabletop the particular kind of camo that we're looking at. So more is more, more is best in this case. It's not a case of less is more as you would think with the normal ambush camo. One point about the Zimmerit area, I didn't try to make the shapes too defined on the area because it's quite rough and these shapes are quite small, so a simple line is really all you need on the areas covered by Zimmerit. So keep the shape small, keep your brush fresh so you have control over what's coming off. The paint's not dragging off, it's painting on nice and solid in one line, and you'll get through this quite quick. I was surprised how quickly I managed to get this done. It seemed like the most complicated part of the camo, but it was, as we say, a doddle. Then it's a coat of gloss varnish all over. Now this is just a light coat, folks, don't put it on super heavy. It's just to give it a degree of protection, especially as there's metal parts on this, but also to let the pin wash flow free. Check the link in the description for how I would actually go about the washing process and the highlighting process in what you might call a standard kind of German camo. One point I would like to make for the highlighting of this particular camo scheme is I kept it to an absolute minimum, really just working the edges and a little bit on internal areas such as hatches and so on, but not too much because it's very, very busy. And no chipping either, because when you've got a camo pattern such as this and then you start chipping over the top of it, you start to lose the shape of the camo. It just starts to look weird, a bit of a mess. Doesn't really work at this scale. I'll move on to the weathering, folks, so that you can see how I got this thing looking really streaky and dirty. And I'm going to be using the same acrylic wash that I used for the pin wash, and that is MIG Camo washes. A great wash for this purpose because it stays active, you can work it. It's not like traditional acrylic paints that are going to dry very quick. The thicker you put it on, the longer you can work it for, and that allows us to create the streaks and softening all over the hull that we want for weathering and rain marks and such likes. I'm using two colours, the dark brown and the ochre. I'm going to be using the ochre colour the most. The dark brown is very strong and it can dominate easily, so the ochre colour will give us the weathered look that we're after in a softer way. Many modelers, especially larger scale modelers, would use enamel products for this, and that's a good way to go too. I prefer acrylics because I do a hell of a lot of painting, folks, and I'm a commission painter, and if I'm working on a large batch of tanks, let's say 20 tanks, I don't want to be sitting with thinner base products for an 8-hour painting session. This acrylic product is great, it's a lot softer on you, it's a lot easier on you as a painter, and at this scale I feel it gives just as good results. What you can see me doing here, folks, the approach I'm taking is to take little dots of the wash straight out the bottle, not thinned, and placing it along the tops of fenders, panels and such likes, and then using a brush which is damp, not wet, it just has to be damp, ordinary water here, folks, because this is acrylics. You're just going to start softening it and drawing it down, and then perhaps drawing it back up and then changing your direction, you know, so that you're holding the kit upside down so that you can soften the other side, and then just keep working it until you have got the streak that you're after, which is soft enough so that it's going to look like a rain mark and not just look like someone's drawn a line down the side of the tank. So make sure you keep your rain marks at different lengths, different opacities. Look for the logical areas that they would run off from, you know, like mounting points and such likes, but don't make it look too streaky or too much like a zebra. That's the real danger. I'm not going to ignore the flat upper surfaces too. I'm going to use the ochre paint only to get some dirt into the corners and around hatches and prominent features, you know, where the dirt maybe would build up. Don't put it on too strong, folks. It could really dominate, but we can't have, especially such large flat areas as this on a weathered vehicle, the nice solid coats of paint just staring at you, because then it'll be like someone's turned on a light. When you're looking at it, it'll just draw your eye straight to it. So soften it down, feather it, work it in. If need be, you can go back and add more. Remember, folks, it's a bit like cooking. It's very hard if you put too much salt in, but you can always add more salt if it doesn't quite taste the way it should. And here I'm working with much smaller quantities of the dark brown wash and then creating the streaks in the same way. And that's pretty much going to cover it for this guide. Check the description below for the link to a guide that concentrates more on the highlighting, the Zimmerit, working with Zimmerit for instance, for washing it and highlighting it. One thing worth showing you here is weathering the rocket launcher. I'm using this Camo weathering product here. Looks like a little makeup set, and it comes with a little makeup applicator as well, but I'm working it on a palette with some water, and I'm going to then wash it into the open end here of the rocket launcher. I'm using this instead of paint because it's quite sooty. You know, pigments have that, you know, gritty look to them, and here we can apply it, work it around the edge a little bit, and then depending on what it is, you can just work it with a damp brush to remove the excess, or in this case I just drew my finger across the front of the open end of the rocket launcher, and that cleared away any excess, making all those little holes that you would expect to see visible. Now there is a slideshow coming up of completed pictures if you want to stay for that, but otherwise it just leaves it to say thanks for watching folks, and thanks to all the subscribers out there, and to you folks that just drop into the channel from time to time to follow what we're doing. If you want to help out the channel, please hit like, subscribe, and if you hit the bell button, that means we'll definitely see you all on the next one.